Namah Shivaya. Namah Shivaya. We'll now begin with the keynote address. Our next keynote address is by Dr. Venu Govindaraju. Dr. Venu Govindaraju is Vice President for Research and Economic Development and Director of the Center for Unified Biometrics and Sensors at the University of Buffalo in New York in the US. He is also a SUNY Distinguished Professor, Department of Computer Science and Engineering, and Director of National Science Foundation Center for Identification Technology Research in the US. His research areas of interest include AI, machine learning, pattern recognition, computer vision, and information retrieval, with contributions to developing innovative solutions in areas such as document image analysis and biometrics. Dr. Govindaraju has co-authored about 400 refereed scientific papers and has been a principal or co-investigator of sponsored projects funded for about $65 million. As an established leader in the field, Dr. Govindaraju has supervised the dissertations of 35 doctoral students and served on the editorial boards of premier journals such as the IEEE Transactions on Pattern Analysis and Machine Intelligence, and is currently the editor-in-chief of the IEEE Biometrics Council Compendium. I invite you, Dr. Venu Govindaraju, to deliver the third keynote address for today. First slide.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for this opportunity to speak today. The title of my presentation is Artificial Intelligence in Education. I know there is quite a bit of apprehension with artificial intelligence today, with it being in the news for perhaps many wrong reasons. But we at University at Buffalo, we are committed to artificial intelligence for social good. Yeah, and education for all is the highest social good, and that spans the divide, the digital divide, not just in terms of resources, but in terms of geography, language, and most importantly, the abilities of our students. So just recently, we were awarded a National Science Foundation Institute grant for $20 million to set up this institute for exceptional education, which essentially is education, special education for children with special needs. This is the highest award the National Science Foundation can make in pretty much any area, and it's very prestigious. So in the last couple of years, about 25 institutes have been set up in the United States. 5 of them are in agricultural space and another 5 in the space of education. So University at Buffalo is leading the Education Institute for Special Needs Children. You also have institutes at Urbana-Champaign, Georgia Tech, North Carolina, and another university. So our institute is essentially set up with 9 different universities coming together, with University at Buffalo leading this group, this consortium of universities. And so we have in our team from the West Coast, University of Washington, Stanford, we have University of Las Vegas, in the Midwest, Urbana-Champaign, and on the East Coast, Penn State, Cornell, and Texas, El Paso, and South. So it covers, pretty much the whole map of the US. And we have experts in natural language processing, computer vision, robotics, communicative disorders, learning sciences. So it's a truly interdisciplinary research team trying to address some of the pressing challenges that society faces today. So if you look at the number of disabilities children could have, they have listed out about 13 different kinds of disabilities, and we have decided to focus on the first, third, and fourth in that list, which is special learning disabilities, autism spectrum, and speech and language impairment. And we'll see how artificial intelligence can be actually used to make sure that no child is left behind. So if you look at, dyslexia, for example, one of the special learning disabilities, it affects many children. It can be seen, the symptoms can be seen in poor reading and writing. And we believe that artificial intelligence can actually make a difference. Approximately 15% of people in the US have dyslexia. This corresponds to about 30 million adults, in the United States. And as you can see in the view graph over there, when writing, dysgraphia, it's essentially when letters get misspelled by, switching and reversing the order. So that's the first, disability that we'll be looking at. And when you talk about autism, the symptoms could be many. It could be, kids who want to stay isolated, don't want to join groups, they have sleeping problems, they reject cuddling, there is hyperactivity, and so on. So there are many different systems where artificial intelligence can clearly play a role in both detecting and then providing with assistive tools so that they can overcome some of their disabilities. So here's an example, a good example, where on the right side you will see an example of how a kid could be asked to lean to the left or right to match the person's expressions. And these are some of the tools that we could be developing using AI. So autism, again, 1 in 36 children, which is about 3% of the population. We are looking at speech and language impairments, various kinds where AI can, play a role. So some staggering facts over here: 5 to 10% of Americans have communication disorders, which costs a whopping 150 to 180 billion annually. The first grade, roughly 5% of the children have noticeable speech disorders. 3 million plus Americans stutter. 7% of Americans have some form of language impairment. Approximately 1 million Americans suffer from aphasia, which is essentially some kind of brain disorder which affects their speech and language processing. So here is a view graph which tells you, if you look at this full spectrum of the 13 disabilities, a big chunk of that relates to speech and language. So here is the challenge for our institute. If you look at, the places where speech and language is a major part of the disability, 3.4 million children are actually affected in the US. And the challenge is that the speech and language pathologists that the schools have is in relation very small. It's only 60,900 SLPs that are available. So you can see there is a massive scaling problem. There is no way that these pathologists can actually address the needs. First, identify the children with the needs and then come up with solutions, which can help them. So our Artificial Intelligence Institute is set up to address this particular challenge. And there is another challenge actually hidden in these numbers, and that is that while the speech and language pathologists are woefully small in number, they are particularly small in areas which need the maximum help, because the pathologists sometimes refuse to go to certain areas, rural parts have fewer pathologists and so on. So the areas which actually need the most help get the least help. So we will be looking at both the scaling issue and the equity issue, and this is the challenge that we want to address with artificial intelligence. So we are talking essentially about a paradigm shift, bring in artificial intelligence tools to help identify the children who need help, and then come up with the tools to actually help them, with whatever disabilities that they have, so that they are not left behind. And in order to do so, we came up with a solution which has two parts. The first part is what we call the AI screener, and the second one is the AI orchestrator. So as the name implies, the screener is essentially to identify all the children who will have some disabilities and who will need speech and language help. And then the orchestrator, once having identified those children, how can you provide the tools so that the pathologists can spend the time with the children? With the help of the tools, they are more efficient, and the help being provided is customized so that each children will get the support that they actually need. So these are the two parts, for our institute that we want to develop. So if you talk about an AI screener, we envision a robot, a robot which is probably in a playroom or a classroom, not conspicuous, unobtrusively somewhere in the corner, and it is essentially observing the children in a group, in their interactions, in their speech, in their gestures, in the way they are communicating, and it is taking notes, right? And then it comes up with a report on which children perhaps need additional help. So that is the AI screener. And then the AI screener can also work on a one-on-one basis, right? Not just in groups. We envision eventually perhaps this can be taken to homes and parents can use them. And so here in this example, you can see the robot is essentially interacting with the child and saying the baby is sleeping, and then asks what is happening here. And based on the child's response, you can determine, what the abilities in speech and language the kid has. And then once we have the screener, then we were looking at the orchestrator. And the orchestrator is all about coming up with intervention solutions. So it could be on oral reading fluency, it could be decoding rules, comprehensive tests, and all these, by the way, based on scholarly articles. So it's all evidence-based on exactly what needs to be provided as support. So we'll be looking at what are called, for each child, there is an IEP target, a planned target of what they should accomplish, how many words in a sentence, how many sentences they can put together, can they do the plural by putting the S in the end, how many words with a particular letter. So all different kinds of metrics will be used. So it's evidence-based intervention methods, selecting from a whole bunch of stimuli material that is available today, and also looking at elicitation techniques in order to provide the intervention. So the idea is that we will implement the AI screener and orchestrator to scale the speech language pathologists. We will adopt first we'll go this way in the virtuous cycle. We will deploy them and validate our tools. Then we will also push the frontiers of learning science. So this is not just about artificial intelligence, robotics, and computer science, but also about learning science and what advances can be made over there. Look at the foundational AI techniques improvement, and that's your virtuous cycle that will come into play. I don't want to get into the details of artificial intelligence for this audience today over here. But we are looking at 6 different thrust areas. So we will be looking at the core artificial intelligence techniques, which can do the generalization based on very few examples. And it is called semi-supervised learning. And we will also be looking at multi-agents, because there are multi-agents at play over here. A whole bunch of core computational technologies will be put into play. So there are many challenges. We are looking at noisy environments. We are looking at privacy issues, right? The data should not leak out. There is privacy that must be guarded all the time. So we will be looking at all these computer science-based challenges, and the data itself is multimodal. It could be expressions, voice, face, gestures, and so on. As I mentioned, in a multi-agent environment, if you look at the speech recognition accuracy, when it comes to speech of children, the word accuracy rate today is quite poor. So we have done some. So if you look at very early, there is no data available, and for the younger groups, the error rates are very, very high. And we are not going to just look at word error rates. We'll be looking at other metrics such as speech stalls, repetition, abandoning words, revision of words, mean length of utterances, and so on. So a whole bunch of metrics will be automatically evaluated both for the screening and the intervention. The vision techniques will work at long distance and low resolution, because you can imagine in a large classroom or a playroom, the cameras are far away. And we are going to make sure that these will be at a cost which will be affordable for all public schools. And also it will be something that can be operated locally. Firstly, for the privacy reasons, that we don't want to put it up in the cloud, where it could be hacked perhaps. And we want the solutions right there, so the solutions can move from classroom to playroom to brought home and so on. So that is also something that we are going to ensure. Looking at a whole bunch of different communication modalities. Text enrichment, this is a very interesting area. So now with ChatGPT and other interesting AI generative tools, if you have a passage, let's say it's a kid's book, we can use AI techniques to expand a passage. So a long sentence can be made into smaller sentences. Words can be replaced. The grammar structure can
Amriteshwari Namaha, I want to start by expressing our gratitude to our C20 Chair Amma, Her Holiness Mata Amrita Devi, for making this event possible. A warm welcome to all the panelists and participants, and thank you for joining us today for the panel discussion on education for inclusion and accessibility. Today, we gather to explore the transformative power of education in fostering an inclusive and accessible society for all. First, I would like to introduce the moderator, Ms. Nariana Shah. Selina Nariana Shah has over 20 years of experience in community, IT, and research. She has worked with prestigious organizations such as the Royal National Institute for the Blind, the Arts Council of England, the European Organization for the Safety of Air Navigation in Brussels. Over 2 decades ago, she transitioned to the field of education, working in state, independent, and autism special schools. Selina's expertise extends to teacher training in computer science education for autistic students, as she worked with the National Centre for Computing Education, NCCE, in the UK. She attained certification for the Autism Diagnostic Observation Schedule, ADOS2, an internationally recognized standard for diagnosing autism. Currently, Selina is pursuing a PhD in Sustainable Development at Amrita Vidyapeetham. Her research focuses in the intersection of education and autism spectrum disorder, with a specific emphasis on training teachers in screening and providing support to autistic children in rural communities. Over to you.
Thank you, everyone. A very warm and heartfelt welcome to each and every one of you that have made it to this session. We're very privileged and excited to welcome you to this panel event for education, for inclusion and accessibility. The objectives of this session is to provide a backdrop for the policy recommendations that were worked on this morning. Thank you, by the way, to the shadow moderator for the warm introduction. So, the way the session is going to work is that each of the panelists here on my right will be given about 5 minutes or so to speak, to talk about their organizations, the work that they do, and also if they'd like to make any sort of additional ideas or suggestions towards the policy recommendations as well. And it's also an opportunity to go a little bit off track in terms of, we've all been sort of talking about very similar ideas up to now. And so if people want to throw something new into the pot, now is the opportunity to do so. Because the material that we gather in the panel events may not make it directly into the recommendations, but we're going to be providing accompanying white papers as well that will go with them. And so this is an opportunity to feed into that process, as well as generally just raising awareness amongst all of us about different issues. So I humbly request that each panelist sort of try to keep within 5 minutes, because so that we can make it to the cultural session later on. And I'll give you a little prompt after sort of 4 or 5 minutes, just to let you know how much time is left. The first speaker we have, we're very privileged to have here, is Dr. A.J. Kumar Singh, who is the in the Directorate of Education, New Delhi. Dr. A.J. Kumar Singh is an accomplished professional with 14 years experience in the field of disability rehabilitation. He has a PhD in inclusive education and has been a valuable asset to the field. Presently, Dr. Singh holds the position of OSD and State Coordinator for Inclusive Education at the Directorate of Education, Government of NCT of Delhi. So we're very privileged to have you here speaking this afternoon. Would you prefer the mic or the podium? Please give me
Ma'am, is it okay to sit and speak?
I'm technically a bit informal, I hope that's all right.
Good afternoon, everybody. I am Dr. Ajay Kumar Singh. Thank you, ma'am, for this warm introduction. message what we are doing in government schools of Delhi. So this is the profile of the Directorate of Education that in line of the RTE Act and RPWD Act, the Directorate of Education providing inclusive education. And in Directorate of Education 1043 government schools are functional and 18 lakh children around studying in these schools. And in Directorate, I think India is the first state in India. Delhi is the first state where we have a cadre of inclusive education. Cadre means from regular teachers at primary levels, special educator, secondary level special education teacher, and senior secondary level, as well as the supervisors at different levels to implement and monitor the inclusive education interventions in the government schools. If we see the data and enrollment of the children with disabilities, so there are the four major categories where children with disabilities are studying. The first is children with intellectual disabilities, children with locomotor disabilities, children with visual impairment including low vision and blindness, and children with hearing impairment. So these are the administrative structure that I was talking about. The Directorate of Education has such a regular system. They are from primary special education teacher, the highest level of the monitoring and implementation. These are the core interventions that we are providing in government schools under the RTE and RPWD Act, that the screening and identification, classroom, inclusive classroom teaching pedagogies, sports and extracurricular activities, transition services, home-based education to children with disabilities who are not able to come in the regular school systems, and resource center for therapeutic services. And there is a specific scheme for the children with disabilities where we are focusing for talent promotion scheme. In this scheme, we are identifying the talents that the children with intellectual disabilities, which talent he or she deserves, and then accordingly we just facilitate these skills to live our independent lives. So these are some highlights of the intervention that I am talked about. So the major and the model practices that we are doing in the government schools. In the last session, we discussed about the public-private partnerships in Delhi in collaboration with private organizations. So we are providing in schools the therapeutical services, having multidisciplinary teams, physiotherapist, occupational therapist, speech and language therapist, clinical psychologist in schools. At present, there are 14 district resource centers are functioning, and all resource centers are in the regular schools. And the department has mapped these 14 resource centers from 30 to 35 schools where children come as per need for their therapeutical services, and they visit time to time as per the recommendation for follow-up activities. These are there is a impact study done by the Directorate of Education on implication of these resource center and therapeutical services multidisciplinary teams, and there is a significant improvement in the different areas. By considering the time, I am just briefing each area like motor, fine motor activities, the children's social adaptive behaviors, daily living skills, attendance, enrollments, their academic achievements. So in all the areas, the children with disabilities who are getting the therapeutical services in these resource centers, there is a significant improvement in these areas, and the Directorate of Education now extending these resource center interventions for more up to 31 resource centers. So all children who need these therapeutical services can get the benefit of therapeutical services, and by getting these services, they can do what they deserve in this in all the areas of their skill and talents. In the area of accessibility, Directorate of Education in all government schools have an assessment of 10 basic infrastructure which are needed for a person with disabilities in a physical infrastructure. In the second phase, in collaboration with WHO India, we are doing this special accessibility audit and gap analysis for all government schools building, assessment of reasonable accommodation of classrooms, case gap analysis of the accessibility related to the tools and devices, and all these area of accessibility, government of Delhi has joined hand with WHO, and accordingly based on this special accessibility studies, the department is committed to provide the school infrastructure accessible in a time-bound manner. In addition to this, we are Department of Delhi is collaborating with especially for accessible audit. We are collaborating with UN Habitat for making the school buildings access audit and to make it accessible. We have also collaborated with UN Women for gender sensitizations and also the empowering of girls with disabilities. We have also collaborated with WHO to make the individual care plan for all child with disabilities, and the first phase has been completed for preparing of master level training, and we are extending from July to all students with disabilities who will have the ICP, individual care plan, for the holistic development of the child with disabilities. We have also collaborated with UNICEF on for the vocational and career counseling for the children with disabilities, and the private partners who are providing the jobs to these children after age of 18 years. In addition to the last slide is we are just planning in the light of the RPWD Act, NEP, to strengthen more, strengthening conducive, inclusive environment, building a positive attitude towards the children with disabilities among all stakeholders, equipping teachers to cater the disability-specific needs of CWD. So now I'm finishing it. Creating awareness among various inclusion about the teachers who are taking care of these children in the regular classrooms. So we are also focusing the pedagogy training, inclusive pedagogy training to all teachers in collaboration with all private partners, NGOs working in the Delhi and NCR regions, so that the teachers will be well equipped to deal the children with disability in regular classrooms. In addition to this, we are also, the policy has framed for pre-vocational training, especially for children with intellectual disabilities and multiple disabilities in coming days. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. That was a lot for us to think about and explore. And I've already made a list of questions for you later, but we're going to move on to our next speaker now. So the next speaker is going to be, bear with me, sorry, here we go. Mr. It isn't Mr. So it's Barsha here, and I'll just bring up the, sorry, Barsha Banerjee. Welcome. Please do. I'm just going to introduce you first. Just give so next we have Ms. Barsha Banerjee, the Managing Director of Perkins School for the Blind in India. It's an institution dedicated to empowering individuals with complex disabilities and visual impairments. With over 24 years of experience in the field of education and learning, she's played a crucial role in fostering growth and development for MSMEs. very much welcome you to talk today, and please do take this podium.
That's okay. Thank you so much, Sel, and thank you, everyone. I think I would feel like an outlier here amongst all the practitioners, educationists, special educators. I come from a corporate background. For 24 years, I've been in the corporate sector. Very recently, I moved into the social sector, very specifically. And it was a decision by choice, a conscious decision to move into the sector, because I think there is lots more for me to learn. There's lots more for me to understand and be a part of this. And I think each of us, as the tagline for C20 says, you're the light. I think we all are, right? Thank you so much, Sel, once again. And it's my pleasure to be here at the C20 Educational Digital Transformation Summit and to be a part of this panel discussion about education for inclusion and accessibility. And of course, as we saw in the afternoon and throughout the day, of course, when masterminds, innovations, and when policies come together, the result is strategies and best practices to build a world where everyone belongs. A better world where everyone has to get accessibility, everything has to be inclusive, and a place for everyone where they can be a part of it. As you can see my screen, of course, we've been hearing a lot of data since the morning. There are 240 million children with disability across the world. As you see the picture, that's 10 million children for each of the 24 smiles that you see here. In low and middle income countries, at least half of these children are out of school, and this is extreme. Children completely out of school. Some never even leave homes. In India, Julie was one of these children. That's Julie in the second row. I'm going to come back to her just in a bit. Children with disabilities are not learning. They're not learning because most people don't know what needs to be done with them. And most humans have a real hard time imagining what they have never seen. It was the same even for me before I came and became a part of Perkins. That's us. I work for Perkins School for Blind. It's an organization which started 194 years back. And that's when we believed that every child can learn. Perkins was the first school for the blind in the United States. And because we have always believed that how children can learn, and we'll help you in case others don't know. For 200 years, we have worked with teachers, leaders, and changing the world that how children with disabilities can do. Anyone in the room recognizes? That's right. Helen Keller was a student of Perkins School for Blind, and her teacher, Anne Sullivan. That's Mexico to Armenia to India to Bhutan. We don't build schools, but we are never alone. We work with partners, government, stakeholders, families, communities. You just have to name it. What we bring is we bring the strength of capacity in terms of accessible learning for everyone. And what we believe that every Helen Keller needs to have an Anne Sullivan. And I think we have a model where which is ready to scale. That's the picture of Julie that I was talking of. Now, Julie was a child who was out of school before Perkins started working with her. today she's in school, and if you can really see that Julie going to school is a game changer for all of us. Because what we believe that children should be in school. That's where they belong. And together, we can actually do this. This year, Perkins will reach 1 million children, but we have 239 million children to go. I think we all can do that together, together as a collective, together as the entire force, the power to come together and bring about a change. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for that very succinct but very beautiful presentation. And I think they're very powerful words, and I hope everybody takes that message away with them as well. Thank you. We now have an online speaker coming from the United States, Mr. Dan Wagner. So I'll just give you an introduction to him, and we'll hopefully have the technology ready in time. And I've just closed my script, so bear with me, please. This is where technology doesn't always work for you. Okay, so Dr. Daniel A. Wagner is a distinguished professor of education at the University of Pennsylvania, where he holds the prestigious UNESCO Chair in Learning and Literacy. We'd like to welcome you, Professor Wagner. I'm just giving a bio introduction for you, and then we'll ask you to speak. We're very glad to see you online. So with a wealth of expertise in national and international education matters, he has provided advisory services to prominent organizations. Notably, Daniel Wagner has chaired the esteemed Brookings Global Research Task Force on Learning, further establishing his leadership in the field. His outstanding achievements were acknowledged with the prestigious 2014 UNESCO Confucius International Literacy Prize. Recently, in 2021, he received the distinguished honor of being elected as an honorary fellow at the Comparative and International Education Society. We very much welcome you here today, Professor Wagner. Over to you.
Thank you very much. Can you hear me? Can you hear me okay?
We can hear you beautifully, thank you.
And I see I have two pictures of me up there. And I also need to share my screen if I can. Let me see if that's possible. I'm having a little bit of technical difficulty here.
We did have something for a moment, that's it.
Can you see the screen okay?
We've got with the full screen, yes.
Okay. Is that okay? You need it bigger.
Do you want to put it into presentation mode and bigger?
I will try. Sometimes it works.
That's beautiful.
Is that working okay?
Perfect. Yeah, perfect. Thank you.
All right. All right. Nice to be with you. Given all the geographical difference between Philadelphia and Kerala, I'm delighted to be with you. Thank you very much, the C20 Digital Transformation Group, for inviting me. It's really a pleasure to be with you. I know it's late in your day, and all I can say is I had to get up very early this morning to join you. My presentation actually follows rather well, I think, from the conversations that have been taking place. I was able to tune in the last hour or so, the two major talks in the plenary, and now just the talk on blind children in India. My talk, in some ways, follows, I think, rather well. It's on the role of technology, or ICT, and learning equity, the need to support marginalized children. And by marginalized children, I would include those who have problems being included, such as those with disabilities or different abilities, as some people prefer to call it, but also those who simply come from backgrounds that are poor and disadvantaged in a number of ways. So that's what I plan to talk about. I will be relatively brief, mainly because I just want to hear, if there is time for conversation, I'd love to hear more in the Q&A. So I'm having trouble advancing my slides. Okay. So I have several main points. And the first one I think is very familiar to those who are on this call today or in the sessions today, that the global use of technologies or ICT is growing dramatically, but also that there's a claim, and I think I heard a little bit of that in some of the prior presentations, that we should expect a great or huge breakthrough in the education realm. My own view is that is unlikely to occur in spite of some of the exciting things talked about, as in ChatGPT earlier today. No question, though, that ICTs are increasing in and out of schools, in everyday life, and of course in school life. But my sense is that the impact of ICT on education today is limited, mainly by a broad failure to reach those most in need, who could benefit most, and thus, naturally, there needs to be a better match between resources for educational purposes and for those marginalized using ICTs. And then I'll end with a few conclusions. So this is a slide I like the most. It shows what we would like to see around the world, and usually falls under the category of technology can leapfrog, or the question is, can technology help to leapfrog in development? There's, of course, lots of excitement. I mentioned AI, but also the fact that there are tablets in schools, there are iPhones or smartphones in many people's homes, there are laptops everywhere, and there are kids who are smiling to us in many of these kinds of scenes. This is the kind of photograph or montage that I'd like to show my students, to say that smiling faces in such photographs can be misleading when looked at the broader goals that we have around development. Misleading in the sense that this isn't everywhere and all the time, obviously. So this is a kind of slide that is often shown at the penetration of ICTs compared with population growth. You can see on this slide, a very well-known slide, that mobile phones are approximating the population size around the world. But it's important to note that the internet itself has not penetrated nearly as much. And as one of the earlier speakers said today in the plenary, the internet has not arrived, I think, more than 60% of the case in Brazil among the population. So there are clear problems of technologies, whatever kind of technologies, reaching the poorest in low-income countries, what I refer to as LICs. Now, if we look at the learning side of the equation, we're talking, I was mentioning first technology, but if you look at the learning side, that is the quality of education, or what some people call, what I call learning equity, there are still huge problems. We know that from the United Nations SDG number 4, which is focused on trying to get quality education to the poorest of the population. And we know that in many ways this is not working very well. And you'll see that in the next slide. But we know what the reasons are for poor learning. There are poor schools in rural communities especially, but not only in rural communities. Poorly trained teachers, even though there are outstanding teachers, there are many teachers, especially in low income and poor settings, that simply have not had much in the way of training. Parents are often low literate or illiterate themselves, and often the languages are out of sync with the mother tongue that kids speak regularly, and so the official language is in contradiction to the local language. And this is a well-known fact, but something very important to pay attention to when we think about accessibility, our panel, the use of technology in low-income settings. So this is another slide that many of you may be familiar with, and it shows what we mean when we talk about poor quality education, when we talk about missing many, many students around the world. This is a graph that kind of revolutionized our thinking about quality of education. That is, lots of kids are getting into school, but lots of kids, even more kids, are now not succeeding in learning even basic literacy. This graph showing that more than 90% of second graders in Mali can't read a single word in any language. So this is not just a question of is it French language use in Mali compared with local languages? No. It means that the schooling quality is so marginal itself that the vast majority of kids can't read a single word, and you can imagine similar kinds of data around other parts of Africa, and which is shown in this slide more broadly. And that has led to a global initiative that I've been part of, and so have colleagues in India, called the Learning Equity Initiative. You can see the logo below. I'll say a couple more words about that later, and if there's time in the Q&A, I'd be glad to say more. So what has happened on the ICT side of the equation for what we think of as ICTs for education? In a graphic that I think is pretty widely understood on the right side of this slide, we can think about ICT for education as a cluster or a Venn diagram that shows in almost every context you'd need to understand what you're going for, your purposes. You have devices, whether it's internet or let's say a tablet or a phone, a feature phone. You have end users, as they call them in the trade, and that would lead to a design solution. One of the interesting things, if you look at the data over time on the left side, the first bullet, it's really almost for about a quarter century of the use of technology, serious use of current technologies for education, which began around the year 2000. They've primarily been driven by what I would call a device-centric approach. That is, you have a cool device, you want to find a way to use it in the schools. India actually has a lot of good examples of that, going back now a decade or 2 decades, but with a general failure to look at the diversity of end users.
Recording in progress.
And end users are a key to understanding accessibility today. They're a key to this issue of marginalization. And only rarely have they been the focus of ICT for education, whether it's in India or in other countries. There's a lot going on in India, as many of you know, but still there is this issue of where do the resources go? Are they going to those most in need, or are they going to what some people would call the low-hanging fruit of urban English-speaking or Hindi-speaking children in India, but also similarly in Brazil and in other countries, especially the poor countries, the poorest countries around the world.
Sir, can we ask you to just wrap up in the next minute, please? Thank you.
Right, that's fine. This slide simply shows that there's diversity across the world, across the regions, in terms of the kinds of responses to the pandemic, which is
recording stopped.
And so, by way of conclusion, obviously, first point, most important point, is poor and marginalized children are often ignored.
Recording in progress.
When it comes to ICT for education. There needs to be a more equitable provision of ICTs for education and paying more attention, much more attention, to the end users, the kids in the schools or even out of school. Another claim of the LEI is that the greatest gains in learning will come from investments in marginalized children and youth, and that has not been the case. That has not been understood by many leaders in education, whether in the private sector, the public sector, or nonprofits, civil society, something I think very important for the C20. And finally, learning equity should be central to all of our efforts around technology and education, and hence this idea of a new learning equity initiative. And if you are interested in learning more and what's going on in India, please contact me at the email address on this current slide. And I'll finish there. Thank you very much for your attention. I'm done now.
Thank you very much, Professor. That was a fascinating talk, very rich with information as well. And the idea of learning equity is one that we can take forward. and this concept that by supporting children that are poor and marginalized, we can actually make greater gains in actual learning itself is a really interesting concept. Thank you. So I'm going to introduce our next speaker, which is Ms. Kate Kurawala. Ms. Kate Kurawala is the founder and president of the Maharashtra Dyslexia Association. Her hard work, determination, and perseverance resulted in the associating expanding and developing, ensuring that children with specific learning disabilities have access to high-quality testing, assessments, and remediation. She was elected a fellow of the renowned Ashoka Innovators for the Public, a Washington-based foundation, and was felicitated as a Woman Achiever of the Year by the Sri Shanmukhananda Fine Arts and Sagita Sabha. So we're very much looking forward to hearing you speak again at one of our events. Over to you.
Thank you very much for that introduction, Sel, and thank you for having me here today. Coming at the end of a long day has its advantages. And this afternoon we already spoke with, we heard Geet and Arun talking about their experiences with learning disabilities. They are wonderful role models for our cause. And they actually did quite a bit of covered quite a bit of the ground that I was going to cover. I won't be talking so much about my organization as I would like to propose certain ideas that I think are very important for educationists and especially people looking at inclusion to think about. Geet mentioned very vividly the importance of screening for children with difficulties in learning, with specific learning issues. And she emphasized the number of children involved. It's a much bigger number than any of the other disabilities. And this is why it becomes very, very important to identify these children. So I would really like to make a case for extensive screening for neurologically based language disabilities so that all children who need help get it at the right age. And the right age means right at the beginning of school. So studies have consistently shown that around 20% of the school-going population struggles with learning to read. And I'm not talking about students who are poorly taught. I'm talking about students who get reasonably good instruction in reading. Of these, at least 50% have previously undiagnosed SLD. Most commonly dyslexia. We're talking here about a very significant number of children. 10% of the student population. So if we consider the millions of children going to school today, we get an idea. 10% of them have a learning disability and need help immediately on joining school. So but the trauma that these students experience is not recognized or understood. For example, Arun had to leave school and go to a special school in order to get an education. And now see where he is. Geet has talked about her difficulties, and I'm sure if you stop by over tea to ask her about something, she will have a lot to say about it. Yet, these are not commonly understood even by teachers and educationists. Instead, these children are labeled stupid, lazy, careless, disinterested, rebellious, disruptive. It's an endlessly negative list of labels. And that, believe me, that really, really impacts them. It impacts their self-image. It impacts their ability to learn, apart from the fact that they never get the help that they need. Too many of these students drop out of school. Unfortunately, a lot of them are pushed out of school because they don't fit in and the schools don't want them. And sometimes this happens even in the early primary years. Common outcomes for children who drop out or who struggle with school to the extent that they just don't fit in: drugs, depression, delinquency. So, and there are studies which have shown, a few studies with prison populations, juvenile populations in prison, which show that up to 50% of them have poor reading skills, reading skills which are not appropriate for their age, which is a classic indication of SLD. So we are talking, even those who do go on to successfully finish school, somehow they get help from wherever, or in many cases they don't get help, but they are able to strategize and stay under the radar and somehow scrape through from class to class. And believe me, I have married into a family where almost everybody is dyslexic. And the whole family, it's a large family full of these people who are now today engineers, doctors even, all kinds of high-achieving individuals, but they all have their stories of trauma to tell. So identifying and supporting these students as they are beginning to read can change these outcomes. And that is why it's important that they be identified. Now, today we do have some mandate for assessment of students with learning disabilities and for some kind of intervention within schools. But this is a drop. It's not even a drop in the ocean, let me tell you. A majority of these students are referred for assessment in middle or senior school. That means they've already had several years of instruction, of struggle, without their struggle being acknowledged. And So this is really what we have as in assessment today and in diagnosis is a wait to fail model. When the child really begins to, when he's in danger of failing, or when she has actually failed a year, then they get referred for assessment. Maybe it's dyslexia, but it shouldn't be the last option that you think of. It should be the first. A simple teacher-based screening tool that flags children at risk as early as 5 years would change that. And it does change it. Several years ago, the National Brain Research Center developed a screening tool, which is a teacher-based checklist for students. And during the validation studies, they asked schools to administer it to all students so that they could gather data for validation. And it had a very interesting effect. The test takes just about 5 minutes per child, and they had, teachers were given this tool to use, say, about 3 months after the term began, so that they were familiar with all the children in the class. They had been able to observe them. Teachers were trained. They were given about 2 to 3 hours of training. Is that right, Geet? Yeah. 2 to 3 hours of training only in the use of the tool, and in some background about learning disabilities so that they understood what they were looking for. And they were asked to go through the checklists. And what we found, at least in Mumbai and Maharashtra where we used it, was that it had an amazing effect on the club. Not only did they identify students as young as 5 years old, they were able to identify students whose intelligence masked the struggle that they had. So they were seeing the kids who later on would have emerged as having a difficulty because they do well in the early years, and then when the demands on the academic demands grow, then they begin to slide. The tool was able to identify even such students. Apart from that, what was interesting was that the teachers, thanks to the training that they received and thanks to being actively involved in observing the children and using the tool, they began to get much more sensitive to the struggles of the children. They began to realize that the kids who they normally would dismiss as, not so interested, not good students, actually had something else going on in the background, and that was impacting their ability to learn. It was impacting their behavior in school. It was something that could be changed around if they changed their approach to the child. So it profoundly impacted not just what, identifying these children and giving them a little bit of help or whatever help was available over there. It also impacted how the teacher taught in the class, or at least their attitude towards the so-called troublesome children in the class. Yeah. So my proposal here is, what we really need is universal screening for learning disabilities. It's very essential because it's a large number of students who are benefited from it, but it also changes the whole tenor of the classroom and general education, especially at the primary level. So I'll leave you with that thought. It is being done in some schools, and it's having a really wonderful effect, but we need it to be mandated. Incidentally, in the state of Maharashtra, it is mandated. We do have a government resolution that all children will be tested for dyslexia and learning disabilities before the age of 9. But 9 is still too late.
Thank you so much for your talk, Kate, and I'm a big fan of screening and screening as early as possible, so it's very much appreciated. Thank you. So we're very fortunate this afternoon. Unfortunately, one of our speakers who is going to be speaking online couldn't make it, Sri Anurag Beher, but one of his colleagues happened to be present, and so he's standing in, he's very bravely standing in. Thank you so much. So I will introduce, sorry, here we go again. Rishikesh B.S., who is joining us here in person. He's the Associate Director of the School of Education at Azim Premji University. He has been with Azim Premji Foundation for nearly 20 years, researching and understanding the Indian school education domain. He has been teaching at the Azim Premji University since its inception in 2011. At present, he is a member of the Technical Secretariat for the Steering Committee drafting the National Curriculum Framework. So we're very grateful that you stood in this afternoon, and I'll just pass the mic over to you.
Good evening, everyone. Yeah, pretty much not just the last session, as ma'am said, but the last speaker of the last session. So I don't know whether it gets easy or difficult. I'm going to try and keep it to 5 minutes so that if we can utilize some time for question and answers before the cultural program, which I don't know whether it would have begun because we passed the time, right? 6:30 when we were supposed to stop. I'm not going to speak much about the Azim Premji Foundation or the university. We have not worked extensively in the domain of inclusive education. We've just about begun in the university over the last year or so. We've been offering inclusive education diploma programs. This is particularly because we do see the dire need for professionals in the space. So there is a lot of learning that is happening within our organization in terms of understanding the domain and how do we ensure that particularly children with various kinds of disabilities, various kinds of difficulties are engaged with so that they are provided meaningful learning experiences. What I would try to touch upon in the next couple of minutes is what Professor Dan Wagner was speaking of. In terms of the kinds of exclusion that exists in our school system. When you look at the degree, you do see that exclusion happens at multiple levels, and it boils down to this small little point that I am unable to engage with the child, and the moment I am not able to engage, I want to exclude the child. It begins with that very basic principle, and what happens is at the end of the day in a country like India, almost 50% of children do not finish school. That's the national average. Nearly 50% do not clear the 12th board exams. And finally, only about 27% are the ones who are enrolling in higher education institutions. So we have almost 3/4 of our youth who do not even enroll in higher education institutions. So that's the kind of exclusion that happens within our system. So when we are talking of inclusion, when we are talking of accessibility, it is just a very, very huge area to work upon. And within that, when we look at, for instance, 10% of children who have disabilities which needs special kinds of attention and special kinds of facilitation, then one can imagine the enormity in terms of the kind of work that is required to ensure that all our children are in school. The fact that a child should be in school is something that I think there is complete consensus. And so if that has to be met, then the enormity of the work ahead is very, very huge. And we need, I think there has been a call since morning about how each one of us will have to engage to ensure that all children are in school. I'm going to give you a very short little story in terms of experience that Azim Premji Foundation had in its early years. There was at that time, early 2000s, this idea that technology will bridge any kind of divide that is there, and technology doesn't come with any biases. So once you bring in technology, any kind of bias that is there because of which exclusion is happening will go away. But when we launched our flagship program, which was a computer-aided learning program, and when we started researching, within 3 to 4 years, we realized that technology in itself is not going to bridge any divide unless the people who are engaging with the technology, who are assisting with the technology, who are using the technology, ensure that they don't have those biases. A small example, our computer learning program had a model where 3 children would use 1 computer. So there used to be 1 screen, 1 mouse, and there are 3 children engaging with some digital material. When we did extensive research, we realized that the way the 3 children were engaging with the computer there and the digital learning resource, there was such inherent bias which existed already. So the child who was sitting at the center of the screen, or the child who was having the mouse in her hand, the child who was one who was dictating terms in terms of how to engage with the digital learning material there were clear biases there, and the children who were excluded were obviously the ones who had various kinds of difficulties, who were anyways marginalized even in a regular classroom. So that marginalization came in spite of you trying to use technology, a non-human intervention. And why was that happening? Right? Because the culture is one wherein there is no inclusivity thought of. So it basically reminds me of Professor Nell Nordings. I don't know how many of you have looked at his work of ethics of care, right? In terms of ensuring that school culture has care at the center of what it does as an organization. And I think that's really where we need to start our work with, in terms of ensuring that educational institutions, be it schools or universities, have care at the center of its culture. It's only then that we can think of inclusivity and accessibility in a holistic manner. Otherwise, a lot of things we may want to do, but it will not yield the kind of results that we intend with all that effort that we're going to put in. And so that's, I think, one point that I would like to really place, that, in terms of ensuring as to how do we bring in care to the core or the center of everything that we do. Very quickly, though, I think I've crossed my 5 minutes, but just one point that I would like to make is another experience that we had during the pandemic. In our university, our students get laptops as soon as they come to the college. So this is again a point to those of us who say that let's give devices to every child, right? And it'll solve problems. Well, our students get a laptop as soon as they come in. 2020, lockdown was announced. It was during the time when they were all in their field research. So as soon as lockdown got announced, they were asked to stay where they are. And as soon as it opened up a little, they were asked to go home. And very soon we started our online sessions. Now, all of them had laptops. All that we had to figure out was some kind of a bandwidth or access to the internet. And many of them found internet access. Most of them found that internet access, which was quite useless. It used to keep dropping. They could never switch on their videos, so hardly any audio available. And hence, we had to put in extra effort to say that all those who had problems in terms of access moved to closer towns where they could get broadband access. So we put in some extra funds, got them rooms in towns and got them there. But then that was just one of the many, many hurdles that existed. A town where you go in, you rent a room, obviously it's not going to be soundproof. There's going to be a market which is right below your room. There's going to be all sorts of noises. So half the time they're muted. When they want to speak, they can't unmute themselves because they're quite embarrassed in terms of the situation that they're in. So, I don't want to go on this, but then just to give you a glimpse of, even when we say access, it is not simply about having a device. There's just so many layers. There's so many degrees of exclusion that happens. So when we think of inclusion in education, when we think of access to good quality education, I think it has to be looked at in a comprehensive manner. And there are just too many things that one will have to think about. And hopefully, since all of us have come together as part of C20, I guess all our ideas coming together, and we dedicatedly with, I think, people like the Delhi SCRT, putting together things on the ground and ensuring that it works and yields the results that we all look for, is really what we could hope for and work towards. Thank you.
Thank you. You very nicely concluded the presentations there by the speakers. So thank you all for your presentations. I very much love the idea of putting care at the center of education, this idea that it's the teacher's perceptions of a child. They just need to see that that is the child in front of them, and then whether their care and the time that's needed for teachers to spend to make sure that they support all their students. Thank you. So I'm going to give the audience a chance for questions and answers. We've had a hand go up there very quickly. So you can please give your name, your organization, which I know already, Marina, and also if you have a question for a particular speaker or for the panel in general. Thank you.
Om Namah Shivaya. Mine is not actually a question, but it's something that came to me when everybody was speaking. And I'm sure you've all heard the story of the Paralympics where the kids were on a race and one of the Olympic kids fell and they all got together and crossed the finish line together. And I think if we put our clients right at the center and ask what they want, they will be inclusive and they will consider everybody. Thanks.
Any questions?
Delhi, sir, shall we allow to visit the schools, government schools mentioned in Delhi? Are we allowed to visit your schools?
Yeah, yes, sure, anytime. After 25th June, the school is opening. So in government school or in private schools, if you want to visit, so surely you are most welcome.
Maharashtra, madam, you mentioned about the slow learning teachers to know how to deal with the students. Are you giving such training to the teachers?
Yes, we are. We run programs for general education teachers to equip them with an understanding of learning disabilities, and we have tweaked that program now to include screening, how to use the screening tool. But it takes a whole decision on the part of the school management to say, yes, we will screen the whole class.
Okay, thank you, madam. But personally, I feel now students who are studying, it has become a stress to the students instead of enjoying the education. You know how to solve this problem.
Okay, nowadays the education become more stressful for the students, so how to solve this problem?
That's a huge question. That's a huge question. There are so many touch points there, which from the examination system to the lack of opportunities for physical activity to also the way things are taught. So I don't know. I don't think we can discuss that here just now. But yes, stress does contribute a lot to it.
Can I add to what she's saying, to what Kate has said? May I add?
Another question here. Thank
To
you.
answer your question, sir, I would say, actually, I don't need it, I'm loud enough. What I would like to say is, like, whatever Kate has said, the education system is really stressing not only kids but parents. How can we change it? Firstly, it's a systemic thing. Okay, forget about that. Agar aap aur main na, if you and I just change our perspective and look for where the kids are getting their happiness. If our goal is that my child should be happy, whether he is happy doing math, English, sports, dance, physical ed, whatever it may be. If you are happy, half your problems are sorted. That's it. Run with happiness. If you are happy, I am happy, the kid is happy, he'll be motivated to work harder. If we're going to keep running after math and science, instead of getting 40, he'll get 60. But whereas he could have become the next Sachin Tendulkar, what have we done? We are cutting his wings and making him go for tuitions. Is that not? So the skill, the strength need not be academic. The strength can be non-academic. In fact, in more cases than not, if you look at the multiple intelligences, out of 9 of them, 7 have nothing to do with maths and English. So that's it. I mean, we just have to look, it's a matter of perspective. That's it.
We have a question here. So this is Sandeep. Right. We're talking about inclusion. I'm going to give my perspective when it comes to deaf people being included in this is my opinion. In the deaf schools, most of the deaf children are forced to learn speech therapy, and like the limitations of speech therapy is that not all deaf children would be able to succeed, and very few percentages succeed in that. Most of them probably prefer sign language, no matter what is the intervention, literacy is not developed. Literacy in education is not the focus. Somehow speech becomes the focus, and they are not able to communicate with obviously, because they're not even in deaf school, so they don't even have anyone to communicate with, so they feel isolated, and I think that is a big loss. Education has to also provide the teachers, the quality of teaching in school can only be improved when they are skilled enough to teach the children in a way they understand. And literacy, and so inclusion is only possible when there is a connect between teacher and the children. And that's possible when sign language is there, when the language is same between the teacher and the student. So a lot of deaf people have given us feedback that they're not really happy with inclusion. Just adding to that, we have done research on perspectives of deaf people on inclusion, and maybe inclusion sounds like a very beautiful word, and you can't find anything wrong with it, and it's not. But the way inclusion has been labeled for deaf community has been you can only be included if you hear. Like if you use hearing aids, if you are cochlear implant, that's the only way you can be included. Why can't you be included with sign language? That's just a language, and the true inclusion would only happen when maximum people can be included. For that, you require skills in the teachers. One observation, this is not a question, this is just an observation. I think the reason we have such, because statistics you've all quoted, I'll just give in higher education, we have less than 0.1% of deaf people in higher education. In school, we have less than 5%. When it comes to reading, writing, less than 2%. And all of this is only because at the policy level, at the grassroots, everywhere, we have people who are not deaf, who are not disabled themselves, making the decisions, talking about it. And I feel sort of like it's time that we pass on the mic, because if we keep on doing it, we don't have the lived experience. We don't know what works and what doesn't work. So I think it would be nice to see panel discussions where we include people who've been through this inclusive system. They'll be able to give perspectives and actual valuable, practical suggestions. We're not people with disabilities. I think our perspectives are always going to be limited. Just that. Thank you.
Thank you. So I'm so sorry, we're going to have to finish the session because we've gone over time this afternoon. I'd really like to thank all the panelists for their talks this afternoon. They've been very elucidating. I'd like to thank the audience as well for their participation and for attending this session. And I think it was really pertinent that we finished with our final question or our final speaker here in the audience. So I wish everybody a very good evening. I believe the cultural program is upstairs. It's about to start. So if you could make your way up there as soon as possible. So could we please just thank our speakers again for this afternoon. Thank you.